The Arizona Territory in 1871 was a place where hate came easier than breath. James Thornton knew this truth better than most. He stood on his failing ranch, watching the dust devils dance across land, so dry it had cracked open like old leather, and he understood that everything he'd built was dying. The cattle were thin, the well was running dry, and his wife Mary lay in their small cabin, weak with fever that wouldn't break. They had come west with dreams 5 years ago, but the desert had other plans. James was 34 years old, gaunt from hunger and worry, his hands calloused and bleeding from trying to coax life from unforgiving soil. He had $17 to his name, 6 head of cattle left from the 50 he'd started with, and a growing certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake bringing his family to this godforsaken place. The Apache raids had been relentless that summer, 3 ranches burned within 20 miles. 5 men killed. Everyone said the Apache were monsters, savages who showed no mercy, and that the only good Indian was a dead one. James had never killed anyone. He'd avoided the war back east by arriving just after Appomattox, and he'd never raised a hand against the Apache, mainly because he'd never encountered them face to face. But he'd heard the stories around campfires and in the territorial capital, stories of brutality and violence that made his blood run cold. Stories that taught him to fear the very name Apache. That morning, as he walked toward his dying well with a bucket, he saw them. 3 Apache warriors on foot, moving across his land like shadows. His heart seized. His rifle was back at the cabin. His nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. This was how he would die, he thought. This was how Mary would be left alone. But as they came closer, James saw something that didn't match the stories. These weren't the fierce warriors of legend. They were struggling. One was barely walking, supported by the other 2. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Their eyes were sunken. They were dying of thirst. James stood frozen at his well, bucket in hand as they approached. The leader raised his hand, palm forward, in what James recognized as a gesture of peace. He spoke in broken Spanish, words James barely understood, but the meaning was clear. Water. They needed water. Every instinct James had been taught screamed at him to run, to get his rifle, to defend his property. These were Apache. They had killed his neighbors. They had burned ranches. They were the enemy. But looking at them, James saw something else. He saw his own reflection. He saw desperation. He saw men who were dying, just as he was dying, just as everything in this desert was dying. The well was nearly dry. What little water remained was precious beyond measure. Mary needed it. His cattle needed it. Without it, his ranch was finished. Sharing it with Apache warriors was madness. It went against every warning he'd received, every story he'd heard, every bit of common sense that said you never helped your enemy. James lowered the bucket into the well. The rope seemed to take forever, the wooden pulley creaking in the silence. When he pulled it up, there was barely half a bucket of water, brown and murky. He carried it to the Apache warriors and set it down before them. The lead warrior stared at him for a long moment, and James saw something shift in those dark eyes. Something like recognition? The warrior drank first, just a little, then passed the bucket to his companions. They drank slowly, carefully, making the water last. When they finished, the lead warrior spoke again in Spanish, more words James couldn't fully understand. But he caught one phrase. No olvidaremos, we will not forget. Then they were gone, disappearing into the desert like morning mist. James stood alone by his well, trembling, uncertain whether he'd just saved his life or sealed his fate. He'd given precious water to the enemy. Water he couldn't spare, water Mary needed. What had he done? 3 days later, Mary's fever broke. James woke to find her sitting up, asking for food, the first time she'd eaten in a week. He cried with relief, holding her thin hands in his, thanking God for small mercies. That afternoon, he walked outside to find something that made no sense. At the edge of his property, someone had dug. Fresh earth lay piled beside a spot that he'd tested months ago and found dry. Curious and confused, James grabbed his shovel and dug deeper. At 12 feet, he struck water. Clean, cold, abundant water, a spring that would never run dry. He fell to his knees in the dirt, overwhelmed. It couldn't be coincidence. But who would have done this? Who would have known? The answer came a week later. James rode into town for supplies, using the last of his money, and found the territorial office in chaos. The Apache chiefs, including the legendary Cochise himself, had agreed to peace talks. The Indian agent, a weathered man named Davidson, was stunned. "They just showed up," he told James and the other ranchers gathered in the office. Said they wanted peace, said something had changed. One of the warriors, name of Nate, told me a story about a white rancher who gave them water when he had none to spare. Said if one white man could show such kindness, maybe peace was possible. James felt the world tilt. What rancher? Davidson shrugged. Didn't say didn't need to? That one act, whoever it was, changed everything. The Apache see it as a sign. Honor for honor. Kindness for kindness. They found that rancher's land and gifted him a spring, and now they want to gift all of us peace. James said nothing. He couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Around him, other ranchers were celebrating, talking about how the war was finally over, how they could live without fear. But James was thinking about 3 dying men and half a bucket of muddy water. He was thinking about how close he'd come to walking away, to choosing fear over compassion. The peace held over the following months, treaties were signed. The raiding stopped. Ranchers and Apache began trading, carefully at first, then with growing trust. The war that had consumed the territory for decades ended not with a great battle, but with a choice one desperate man made on one desperate morning. James never told anyone it was him. It seemed too impossible, too strange. How could half a bucket of water end a war? But in his quiet moments, working his ranch with water flowing freely from the spring that appeared like a miracle, he understood. The Apache hadn't needed much, just recognition. Just acknowledgement that they were human beings suffering under the same sun, dying from the same thirst. Years later, when his children were grown and his ranch was prosperous, James would sit on his porch at sunset and remember that morning. He'd remember his fear, his hesitation, and the moment he chose compassion over hate. He'd think about how we're taught to fear those who seem different, how we're told that kindness is weakness and suspicion is wisdom. But James knew better. He'd learned that in our darkest moments, when we have nothing left to give, that's when our choices matter most. He'd learned that seeing our shared humanity, even in our enemies, especially in our enemies, is the only thing that can break the cycle of violence that keeps us all dying of thirst in the desert. The spring still flows today on land that's been in the Thornton family for 5 generations. And if you ask the descendants about it, they'll tell you about their ancestor James, and the day he chose water over war and changed history with half a bucket and an open heart.